If your organization is ready to enhance cyber resilience, we have important insights for you. The Level Blue Futures Report 2024 sheds light on how rapid computing changes affect IT visibility. Our research reveals that while IT leaders see positive outcomes, 85% acknowledge increased risk. In this report, we identify the barriers to cyber resilience, the challenges impacting cybersecurity, and the business context that reveal operational issues. You'll also discover what's on the horizon and 5 essential steps for prioritizing cyber resilience. Get your complimentary copy of this crucial research today by visiting securityweekly.com/level blue. Cybersecurity simplified. Your customers' and employees' identities are your responsibility to keep safe. But who is helping you stay safe from identity-based threats? Identity is the key to getting security right. And with the right identity partner, so much more is possible for your business than you thought. From strengthening cybersecurity to increasing revenue to reducing inefficiencies and costs, Okta unlocks growth and new possibilities for its customers. Go to securityweekly.com/Okta to learn more about Okta and the company's commitment to leading the fight against identity attacks. ThreatLocker implements a least privileged approach to cybersecurity, blocking every executable unless specifically authorized by your team. This methodology mitigates ransomware, supply chain attacks, and zero-day exploits, and ensures 24/7, 365 protection for your organization. To learn more about how ThreatLocker can help prevent known and unknown threats in your digital environment, safeguard your data and operations from threat actors, and align your organization with respected compliance frameworks, visit securityweekly.com/ThreatLocker. Welcome back to Business Security Weekly. I am your host, Matt Alderman, joined by Jason Albuquerque. You're invited to InfoSec World 2024 at Disney's Coronado Springs Resort in Lake Buena Vista, Florida, from September 23rd to the 25th. Join top cybersecurity experts for this premier event. Save 25% on your pass by using code ISW24-SW25 when you register at securityweekly.com/InfoSec World 2024. Don't miss out on this exclusive opportunity. Allan Alford has worked in cybersecurity for over 20 years and technology for over 25. He started in IT, pivoted to engineering and product security, and brought it all back around to a CISO role that oversaw both enterprise and product. After 5 stints as a CISO in various industries and companies ranging from 18 to 50,000 employees, Allan launched a consulting practice with a partner that provides fractional CISO, strategic cybersecurity consulting services, risk assessments, maturity assessments, and other services. Allan gives back to the community by the way of the Cyber Ranch podcast and by his prolific writing on LinkedIn and articles for various publications. Allan, welcome to Business Security
Well,
Weekly.
thank you. I'm glad to be here. I'm
Well,
prolific.
you are prolific. At least your bio says you're prolific. I think you're pretty prolific. I mean, you and I had done some work together when you were on the CISO advisory board at Living Security. You have your own podcast, which probably a lot of our listeners also listen to. So it's always great to have a fellow podcaster on.
Well, thank you, sir.
All right. So let's get into this segment, right? So you've been a CISO, 5 or so times now.
Mm-hmm.
The role has evolved, but then it's also almost devolved in some respects, right? Like the role has gone through a lot of change. So you know, what are your thoughts on what's going on with the latest? These last couple of years have been interesting.
Yeah. So it began as a much more technical role and almost always reported into the CIO. Like full stop, that's where it began. It was a very technical. You're the security guy, along with the infrastructure gal, along with the applications gal, and whoever. There you are. You three report to the CIO. It's evolved to become much more of a business role, at least for those of us that have evolved with it and brought it in the direction I think it always needed to be brought. It's become more of a business role. That being said, there's been some weird challenges and some juking and swaying and odd things that have occurred since it became more of a business role. We're seeing CISOs who have been called out, specifically in lawsuits, SEC filings, et cetera. There's a lot of concern now that the more businessy the role has become, the more risk the CISO is bringing on in terms of their not just personal career, but whether or not they go to jail in some cases. So as it's become more of a business role, it's got a bigger bullseye on its forehead.
Yeah.
or
I
back.
mean, we've talked about this a bunch on the show, right? I mean, the risks have gone up, the pressures on the CISO have gone up,
Mhm.
and all the accountability lies on the CISO. But we harp on the culture of cybersecurity, meaning that it needs to be ingrained in the business.
Yep.
When you're talking to emerging CISOs, what are you giving them for advice when it comes to that? Because let me tell you, there's so many young, smart, business savvy security professionals coming up in the industry right now.
Mhm.
And the
Mhm.
questions they have for me is it worth it?
Yeah. Yeah. So my first advice is exactly that. It's caution. Do you really want to sign up for this mess? Because it is a crappy lifestyle in a lot of ways. It really is. Be prepared for the 1 a.m. phone calls. Be prepared to be the
Mhm.
accountable guy, even when you feel like you have no authority. Be prepared for any number of bad twists and turns. If you have the stomach for it, it can be very rewarding. And what I'm telling everyone who's trying for the CISO role these days is, and it's almost flaunting in the face of all the stuff we just characterized about SEC and lawsuits and everything else. What I'm telling up and coming folks that want to become CISOs is this: your peers or the people that are already CISOs who use the phrase "all of the accountability and none of the authority" are whiners. Don't be one of them.
Mm.
The people who say, "I am just here to consult and advise to the business. I don't own the risk," are idiots. Don't side with them either. There is no C-suite role on planet Earth
Mhm.
where you get away with not owning your domain, not owning the risks associated with your domain, and simply being an advisor. And yet CISOs have been trying to play that card this whole time, while, ironically enough, complaining that they don't have a seat at the table. I believe these two things are connected. And so I tell people, don't be one of those folks. You do in fact at a minimum co-own the risk. All of the leaders of the business, you're there to advise on it and say, hey guys, by the way, I appreciate we're going to launch this big new SaaS offering, and I appreciate we got quarterly constraints and sales needs to meet goals, and we think this app can get out the door in time, and the CTO is promising it might be a little buggy, but and the sales team is like, we can make the projections if we get it out there quickly enough, et cetera, et cetera. Somewhere in there, the CISO chimes in and says, hey, by the way, lots of security risk with this plan, lots and lots, in fact. And then a conversation ensues. And that conversation is a conversation of C suite peers. And the CISO is one of those peers. And at the end of the day, the group decision is made, or the CEO declares, or some level of party line is established. We're going to go forward with this despite the risks and the complaints are all in agreement. And the answer is yes, we're all in agreement. Otherwise, I'm quitting my job. Yes, of course. If I'm here, I'm still in agreement, and if I really disagree that strongly, I can walk. But otherwise, yes, I just co-owned risk. I just signed up for risk because I am a C-suite person wearing my big boy pants.
Now, that assumes, Alan, that you have the seat at the table and you are considered part of that C-suite, which I still think is a challenge in a lot of organizations where
Mhm.
it's not necessarily at the C-suite. You're not in those conversations, which makes this discussion a little harder, doesn't it? Because you're not
Sure.
at the table.
Yeah, sure. And I think the way you get to the table is by operating exactly like I just described. If you are complaining and whining, if you're playing the authority accountability card, if you're playing the, nobody listens to me and woe unto me card, if you're playing the I don't own the risk card, you're never going to get the seat at the table. You act like an executive, mature C-suite person to earn your spot as an executive, mature C-suite person. You have to always be moving upward. You have to be aspiring for something and acting like the thing you're aspiring for. It's the old dress for success, the
Yep.
dress for the role you want, not the role you have, right? Like it's really that simple. And if you fight and you do that, and you've been in the seat for a year and a half, 2, 3 years, and you still don't have your seat at the table, okay, you're probably in the wrong shop. Move on,
Yep.
right? But, give it 3 years, and the odds are if you stick with it and keep doing those things and keep having the conversations, keep bringing your peers in, keep acting like a business person and not a security person, odds are you'll get that seat.
Yeah. And Alan, we talk about it, a lot in our leadership segment that we do in on this podcast. And don't allow leadership to be a title
Mhm,
or a portion of an org chart.
mhm.
Have it be your every ounce of being and
Yes.
lead, right? And if
Yes.
it takes having a conversation with folks in the C-suite, even though you report to the CIO, so
Mhm,
be it,
mhm,
right? And call for that seat at the table and say, listen,
mhm.
we have to have these risks conversations with these other C-level executives and really push forward. You're absolutely right. Act the role that you want to be in, right?
Yep.
No matter where
A
you are in the org chart.
and I've experienced in my career bosses who were blockers. We've all been there before. The boss who takes the credit for your work, gives the blame, sits on you, keeps you from growing and going beyond them. It does happen. Don't get me wrong. That does happen. Identify that, get out early if that's the case. But if that's not the case, you can get there by pushing hard and doing the right things.
So, Alan, we talked about kind of the migratory trends, right? So, technical role evolving into business role. And if I don't make that transition, where do I go? Like, what happens to the technical CISOs that have been in this for, 15, 20 years? Are they exiting the CISO role into another role? Like, what's happening with some of those more technical CISO roles that are now evolving into business CISO
Yeah.
roles?
So some of the companies are definitely punting the technical CISOs and not backfilling with a technical, which does indeed leave a technical on the bench wondering now what. I think there's still plenty of companies that see it as a technical role, want that technical person. There's a lot of CISOs that are doing what I did. I am seeing a lot of CISOs coming to me in the last year alone, just in the last year, like because I started this about 2.5 years ago, running my vCISO practice, and within the last year, I must have had 3 dozen CISOs come to me and go, "How did you do that? How do I start? I want to do this too." So there's a lot of people that are flipping to consulting. We're seeing a ton of that. And one piece of advice I always give folks, if you've been a highly technical person, had the CISO title, never really quite felt like a real CISO, didn't feel like you were being treated like a real CISO, and haven't connected the dots between your super technical nature and those two facts, you know, have an honest self-reflection moment, because the truth is the world needs more senior security architects driving what we're doing in the shops. There are some highly technical, highly senior roles that are so much more valuable in some ways than the CISO. I would rather see a highly technical CISO transition to a principal or fellow security architect driving the technicals on what security looks like for that entire company's everything, including whatever their SaaS offerings are and all that. Like, that role is so valuable and so needed. And if you can get over the ego blow of, gee, I'm that now and not the C title, it's a much more rewarding career in some ways. And there's no bullseye on your forehead either.
Yeah. I
And
mean,
generally speaking, you get to go home at the end of the day and not get the 1 a.m. phone call either.
right. Yeah, I mean, what are you seeing for trends? Because I mean, again, it's conversations that's constantly happening about what that career path for the CISO is. We've
Mhm.
talked about it on the show, chief risk officer. Are there lateral moves?
Mhm.
Are there vertical
Mhm.
climbs for CISOs? What are you seeing for trends around that? I mean, vCISO is a perfect example of,
Yep.
all right, it's lateral, but now it's consulting. So now you're more engaged with other businesses and
Right.
a little bit more on the getting in depth to different type of verticals and
Mhm.
clients and things of that
Mhm.
nature, the consultative side. So I actually look at that as more of a promotion, to be honest with you, because you're a consultant now as well. So
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
adds to that business acumen. But what are you seeing for trends around that career path for a CISO?
Yeah, I wanna say it was about 2 years ago on my podcast, we did a life after CISO episode and talked this through, and in those 2 years, it has evolved and offered more options than we talked about 2 years ago. It all depends on how successful you were as a CISO. Let's start there, because there's plenty of CISOs that were rolling in the bank, early on, and have found themselves able to step out and basically, do the investor/advisor lifestyle and no more. They've got enough money they're sitting on now that they exited out at the peak of the cash moment, and now they're just advisors and investors. That's a worthy and noble pursuit if you can afford it. Do that. I think that's a great way to end your CISO career. You're helping the entire cybersecurity industry. You're contributing really meaningfully all the expertise you built up over all those years. Not all of us pull in that much money, so that option is not available for everybody. But I've seen, to your point, chief risk officer be the next pivot point. I personally pivoted from CISO to CTO one time, and that evolved into a COO role. I was number 2 at a startup, running, effectively everything but sales at one point. And, if you are a business acumen CISO, any other C-suite title should be within reach.
Mhm.
Mhm.
CTO is a fun one. Chief digital officer. Some of the bigger companies have chief digital officer. And then you'll even see transformation officer. Like there's,
Yeah, right,
it
right.
depends on how big they are and where they are and what they have. But if you take your security expertise and your technical background and your business leadership skills, you should be able to apply them to any of the other C-suite roles that also have a technical background but require business skills. You should be able to make that transition. Even if you have to drop down to a startup to flip the first switch, do it. Startups are many hat organizations. We all know you can, I can come in as CISO and end up as CISO, CTO, CDO, CRO, CO, all the slashes in your title. Like a startup will afford you that opportunity to do more things and get the title, and then you can leverage your entire career. The fact that you were at bigger companies before,
Hmm.
now you have the title, you can bounce back to the bigger companies. That's one path. I know a lot of folks that have done the authoring and podcasting type stuff to supplement income and kind of coasted out that way. I've seen people take advisory roles that were cash instead of equity. That's rare, but those opportunities are out
Hmm.
there. And sometimes people coast out that way. But the VCSO path seems to be the most popular one these days. It really does.
Yeah. No, I was just gonna say, the path that you took is very similar to mine, and going from a larger organization and becoming a business leader, like a chief operating officer or CIO, will tell you, it's worth its weight in gold,
Mhm.
because going from a CISO to a CIO to a chief operating officer,
Yep.
gradually you learn the business, right?
Mhm.
And you're talking about P&Ls, you're talking about
Yeah.
cash flow, and you get that business acumen, and it's worth its weight in gold. So I would highly recommend a path like that if you want to really fine tune your business acumen.
Indeed. Indeed.
So, Alan, we've got traditional CISOs migrating out. VCISO is a path. Who's backfilling? Now, you said in certain cases the technical CISO is not getting backfilled, but where are the next business CISOs coming from? Like, where are they going to come through traditional security ranks, or are they going to come from elsewhere?
Let's start with the fact that some companies aren't backfilling at all.
Mhm.
That's its own variable that needs to be talked about in this conversation, is the fact that some companies are letting go of the CISO role and they're realizing, yeah, okay, we're okay without it for now. Maybe that's a for now proposition. Maybe in 2 years they freak out and get one again. But right now some of them are coasting without one and seem to be comfortable with that decision. We've seen a couple of popular incidents in the press lately where companies have been slammed. There's a breach, and then they look at the CISO and find out the CISO didn't have a security background at all, or she was a music major, or he came up through the sales ranks, or whatever the various and sundry stories have been. And I always tell people, don't treat that story as a screw up on the company's part. Treat that story as a screw up on the entire community of CISO's part. Because what that's really indicative of is the business decided, I would rather have the business skills from over here than the cybersecurity skills from over there when it comes to filling this role. The business spoke. Now they may have been wrong, and the breach may well have been because they made the wrong decision. There's a possible plausible connection there. But in all cases, it's the business speaking to what the business wants. And that tells me that the next wave of CISOs may well not be coming from these security ranks. If you've got the business chops and can fathom security well enough, it may be that the deputy CTO becomes the next CISO. It may be that the CIO's right hand becomes the CISO, even though they didn't start in security. There's a lot of that kind of stuff happening out there now. And I don't think companies are wrong for choosing business over security when it comes to the
Yeah.
CISO role. I don't
Are
think
you,
it's a wrong
Alan? Are you
play.
seeing that? Are you seeing any trends or hotspots depending on vertical or size of business or things of that nature? I mean, with the economic climate the way it is, the regulatory
Mhm.
landscape the way it is, the threat landscape the way it is, I almost feel like it could be across the board. But are there any hotspots where you see that more often than not, that they're shedding the CISO role?
Yeah, I can name the industries where they're not doing that, right?
Okay. Okay.
Financial services is holding steady.
Yep.
Those guys are heavily regulated and understand and appreciate and value that role, even if that role is a little more technical at times, and maybe that person's not got a seat at the table. They're still making sure that the regulatory stuff is met, and
Mhm.
everyone recognizes that's a valuable component to the whole equation. So anyone else who's heavily regulated, probably not dropping the CISO role either. Startups used to bag a CISO around, say, Series C, full-time CISO. And I'm seeing that the startups are now doing more like Series D, Series E, E round, D round before they say, full-time CISO. That's kind of become a trend where the startups seem to be pushing it out a little further. Um, there's some other random trends throughout. I think SMBs are, there's more of it used to be VCISO was almost guaranteed to be smaller company clients.
Mhm.
And now I think we're seeing a lot of mid-market
Yep.
VCISO, where the mid-market is saying, "Yeah, we can get away with a fractional or a virtual or whatever the story might be. We don't need a full-time CISO, even though we're a 2,000 person company at this point, or a $1 billion company at this point." You're seeing more of them actually go fractional now too. So I think there's a random bunch of trends from different ways of looking at it. Sometimes it's about the vertical, sometimes it's about the size.
Yeah, when I look at the trends in the public market, right? You have what roughly half of the Fortune 500 doesn't have a named CISO,
Mhm.
which is
Mhm.
interesting. Then
Mhm.
you go a tier below that and you start looking at those other 3,000 or so public companies. Some have CISOs, but a lot of them don't. Like I
Mhm.
was
Mhm.
I tell the story, I was sitting next to a gentleman at the bar in Boston. He was the CFO. Security rolled up to him. He didn't have a CISO,
Mhm.
right? And so I see that in the public companies. And so sometimes you see the CFO being responsible for reporting on the cyber risks,
Yep.
not the CISO.
Mhm.
Do you see that same kind of trend also, kind of for those public facing companies?
I've seen that. If there's a chief risk officer, sometimes there's not a CISO. Sometimes the CFO owns it and holds it all. Sometimes the CISO reports to the CFO, and there is in fact a CISO role, but they're under the
Mhm.
CFO, not anyone else. I've been a CISO reporting to a CFO. That one's very interesting. Um, yes, I think the overall trend is we're seeing less CISOs in the field. Period. We are. Um, but the CFO component, the CRO, risk officer, not revenue officer component, like we're seeing some shifts in the wind there for sure. I think there are less CISOs now in public companies than there were 2 years ago.
Mhm.
Like I said, CISOs are peeling away and companies aren't necessarily backfilling.
Right.
Yeah. So the language of the business. We talk about this. We actually had Sumedh Takar on last week talking a little
Mhm.
bit about this, right? That language varies a little bit, I think, based off the type of CISO you're going to bring into the organization, right?
Mhm.
If you're a technical CISO, that language might be more technical. Whereas if you bring in a business CISO, it's going to be more business focused.
Mhm.
Where does risk play into this a little bit? Is risk the component that ties both the kind of the technical and the business together, or are they just separate languages altogether?
I I think we have to look at the history of business first of all to answer that question. Let's start with the fact that risk has been around since the dawn of time. The first actuarial table is from the 1500s. It goes that far back. So business risk as a discipline, as a thing to be dealt with and managed in a predictable and measurable and steady way has been around since long before cybersecurity was ever a thing.
Mhm.
And so if we are going to be cybersecurity practitioners and we're going to put risk on our banner and charge forward into the battlefield with risk flying from our pole, we better darn well take into account the fact that risk is already a big thing. There's already a bigger pole with the word risk on it on the battlefield, and we better darn well synchronize with that as quickly as we humanly can. If you're talking about an enterprise, you've probably got an ERM. You've got an enterprise risk management thing. You've got a council. You've got a CRO, a chief risk officer. You, as the cybersecurity leader, are probably one member of that risk board, who in turn is the chair of your own cyber risk board. And you're taking the cyber risk stuff and you're rolling it up and translating it to business risk and bringing it to the table when it seems applicable. You may well find that 80% or 90% of your cyber risk that you're talking to your team about you don't put in your pocket when you walk into the ERM committee. You only bring the ones that truly, meaningfully have business impact. And you have to understand how your business thinks about that because it's not just, yes, 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 this is an ancient discipline and we all know it and understand it. In theory, we do. Every business has its own flavor and variant of how they address and deal with that. Some businesses are much more risk tolerant than others. It's interesting how in cybersecurity we say, find out what the business's risk tolerance, and then we very quickly say they have no idea what their cyber risk tolerance is. This is not an uncommon story. However, they probably know what their business risk tolerance is because it's been around longer, and the giant world of corporations has kind of forced them to know what their business risk is, their appetite for business risk. So fit into that or fail.
Yeah, Matt knows I'm smiling because I've been touting this for years. Where it's like I've basically said for CISOs and leaders who want to grow up in the cybersecurity realm, sharpen your enterprise risk management skills, or you're
Mhm.
going to be replaced by someone who has skills
Mhm.
and can do that. Right?
Mhm.
Been saying that forever, right, Matt?
Yes. And I think about what transpired last weekend, right? Less than
Yeah.
like a week and a half ago, right? Because I've been reporters have reached out and said, well, what do you think about this whole thing? So here's the question that everybody needs to ask. Was the cost of prevention worth it over the outage that transpired from deploying that technology,
Mhm.
right? That's a very valid
Mhm.
question in a
Mhm.
enterprise risk management conversation. And I think,
Mhm.
Alan, this puts a very interesting twist on cybersecurity funding and budgeting going forward.
Yes,
Is
it
that
does.
CISOs are going to have to understand, is the cost of mitigating a risk worth the risk itself? And if
Mhm.
they can't answer that question, I think cybersecurity budgets fall under more scrutiny, which
Mhm.
means fewer investments in certain areas. And I think that has some downstream effect to the entire cybersecurity
Mhm.
ecosystem, I think at
Mhm.
some point. Am I wrong?
Nope, that's exactly it, and it's, it's actually a three-stage calculus now because long before incidents like that occurred where the cybersecurity tool actually broke things, let's just start with the basic analysis of a cybersecurity tool costs X, and it's preventing a risk that we're estimating costs Y, and how we even make that happen before we then say, "Oh, and X might totally backfire and cause Z." That's a new one, right?
Yeah.
Let's even start with a basic formula. You cannot do risk analysis meaningfully without understanding the culture of the specific business you're in,
Mhm.
first and foremost. You may find that the old school 5 by 5 grid works. You may find that they actually are like loss exceedance curves, Bayesian math, Monte Carlo sims. You don't know how hardcore they're going to get on measuring their risk. So that's the first step, is figure out how serious we are about measuring risk and outcomes. You have to, as honestly as possible, predict what the cost would be of the bad thing, then honestly and accurately figure out what the cost of the mitigating control is, and then you bring it to the table, and there's almost always, if they have their act together, a formula, and that formula is often something like 10x, for example. If it's gonna cost me 100,000 to save 1,000,000 in damages, that's 10%, that's worth it. Any higher than 10%, the answer is no, we'll take the hit. Different businesses have different formulas. Sometimes it's that
Mhm.
easy. But now we have the new equation of, "Oh, and by the way, that 100,000 might actually cause 1,000,000." And that's not one anybody predicted or saw coming, and it's definitely gonna be a wake-up call, and again, the organizations that are more mature, that already have these processes in play, are now gonna have to calculate out, this is back to almost the actuarial table type model, but think about, okay, so we've deployed, I'm gonna make up numbers now, we've deployed 1,000 security controls over the last 10 years. Of those 1,000, 1 backfired, but when it backfired, it caused grievous amounts of downtime, and we lost X hundreds of million or whatever the answer is. And that now has to be calculated in the whole equation. It has to
Mhm.
be there. It has to be there now. There is a risk of blowback. It's not, the car insurance metaphor has been forever thrown in the trash.
Yes. And
Yeah.
it was funny because Jason, we actually talked a little bit. Sumed gave us some examples of
Mhm.
this. My cyber policy costs me this much. It covers 92% of what my risks are. Well, do I need to spend to cover the other 8% in security products, or do I just bump up my cyber insurance policy and call it a day? What's more cost effective? These are conversations that are starting to happen. And
Mhm.
to me, if you're a CISO not in a position to have these conversations and talk this way, it's going to be really hard for you to get anything justified going forward, especially after last
Full
weekend.
stop.
Yeah.
Full stop.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
one thing to keep in mind about cyber insurance too is it's not a true transference of risk. Everyone acts like it's a transference of
Yeah.
risk. The downtime represented by the backfire we just saw, that downtime is still there.
Yep.
Mhm.
Yes, you get a cyber insurance company who's willing to pick up the tab and pay the ransom and put the pieces back together over the next 3 months, but during those 3 months, you're still down. So there
Right.
is no 100% transference either, and that always
Right.
has to be calculated in too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, Alan, we talked a lot about, business acumen. We talked a lot about bringing risk management to the table.
Mhm,
Those are pieces to a larger puzzle because I think communication skills, the ability for storytelling, having somewhat of a I don't want to call it sales, but the ability to influence, right?
mhm,
Having
mhm,
having that personality where you can sit in front of a board of directors who are not from IT, who are not from cybersecurity, who may not even have a technical background at
mhm,
all,
mhm,
and be able to articulate the message of the technical, the risk, right? And really be able to speak to those folks and influence, I think is a core component to what today's
Absolutely.
CISO or chief risk officer, or you name the title that's going to sit there and take accountability and responsibility for cyber risk within the organization. I think those are important skills that folks need to really focus on as well.
Absolutely. And you are talking to a CISO who is a strong extrovert, who has a liberal arts undergrad.
Yep.
I learned how to talk, write, communicate, summarize, research, analyze, quickly distill. I learned all those skills as a
Hmm.
liberal arts undergrad. I got a master's in infosec, just for those who are worried I'm another one of the music major CISOs. But my undergrad in liberal arts, I cherish and value even more than I do my master's in infosec. I really do, because
Yeah.
I learned so much about communication there. And I'm an extrovert. And if you go look at my Clifton strengths, I don't know if you guys are familiar with, everybody knows
Absolutely.
Myers Briggs,
Yep.
and
Yep.
my wife's a neuro and rehab psychologist. She knows all these tests and testing.
Hmm. Hmm.
The actual accuracy of Myers-Briggs is it's crap. So ignore that one. But
Yep.
Clifton Strengths is actually highly accurate, reproducible, consistent, etc. And what it does is it doesn't tell you what you are, it just tells you where your predilections lie.
Hmm.
And my number one is woo. I
Nice.
like to woo people. So, yes, these skills are valuable. I am a wooer who has a liberal arts degree, is a storyteller, and is an extrovert. Heck yeah, I'm successful as a CISO.
Yep.
Yeah, that's why we cover leadership and communications
Yep.
typically on this show,
Mhm.
right? Because we think those skill sets are so important in this role. That's why we spend that second segment most
Yeah.
weeks covering those, Jason, as
Mhm.
you know.
Yep. Yep.
And so yeah, I mean,
I
I
mean,
guess I
Alan,
have a
that's
little
a great
woo in me
point. You
too,
know,
but
for folks who are listening, go take strengths finders
Yes.
to see where your skill sets are. I mean, I know right off the cuff, mine is command, communication, context, maximizer, and futuristic. Of course, I'm going to be able to speak to a set of board of directors, or be on a podcast, or be able to communicate to folks who we may not be on the same page. But at the end of the day, it's worth going out and taking a strengths finder, see where your strengths are. And if
Mhm.
communication isn't in there, all right, start working on that, because it's
Yes.
going to be a necessary skill for you to be successful.
Absolutely, and it's like $50, I think, to
Yep,
sign up for it, something like
exactly.
that. Go do it.
go do it. I went through enough training classes over the years to give me more comfort in front of people, because if you looked at me in high school and said that guy's going to have a podcast someday, you would have laughed your ass off.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Yep.
Alan, this was awesome. Thank you so much for joining us on Business Security Weekly.
Well, thank you guys for having me, man. I always love, having a good chat about these topics, and I'm glad you guys are hammering on these themes on your show. This is valuable, it's needed. The community, deserves all that you guys can muster.
Thank you. Thank you, Jason, for joining me. Thank you, everyone, for watching and listening. We'll see you next week on Business Security Weekly.